Victoria Hale had humiliated countless people in her 32 years, but she never imagined the scruffy man she mocked in seat 4B would be the only thing standing between her and death at 30,000 feet. When the captain's desperate voice crackled through the intercom, "Is there a fighter pilot on board?" the cabin fell silent. Everyone turned to stare at the quiet, single father she'd spent the last hour belittling, the man cradling his terrified daughter against the storm tearing their plane apart. Ryan Mercer stood slowly, his calloused hands still trembling from her earlier insults, and walked toward the cockpit. Victoria's perfectly manicured world was about to crash, and only the man she deemed worthless could save it. If you want to see how arrogance meets its reckoning at 30,000 feet, stay with me until the end of this story. And please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this journey travels. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, on a cold November evening in JFK Terminal 4, where two lives were about to collide in the most unexpected way. The business class lounge at JFK hummed with the refined murmur of expensive luggage and more expensive egos. Victoria Hale stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection sharp against the darkening tarmac, Armani blazer crisp as fresh $100 bills, hair pulled into a ruthless chignon that said she meant business before she ever opened her mouth. At 32, she'd built Hale Dynamics into a tech empire worth $3.7 billion, and she wore that number like armor. Her assistant's voice chirped through her Bluetooth earpiece. "Ms. Hale, the car's waiting to take you directly to the gate. Your flight to Zurich boards in 40 minutes. Tell them I'll board when I'm ready, not when they tell me to," Victoria said, not bothering to lower her voice. A woman nearby glanced up from her tablet, then quickly looked away. Victoria noticed and felt the familiar thrill of dominance. "And confirm the hotel has the penthouse ready. I don't care what it costs." Gone. She ended the call with a tap and checked her reflection one more time. Perfect. Untouchable. Exactly how she liked it. The gate area was less refined, a mixing bowl of business travelers, families, and what Victoria privately categorized as people who shouldn't be here. She spotted her seat assignment on the boarding pass, 4A window, business class. At least she wouldn't have to suffer through the indignity of sitting near economy. But when she approached row 4, her perfectly ordered world developed its first crack. A man sat in 4B, middle seat, right beside hers. He wore a faded denim jacket over a gray Henley that had seen better days, jeans worn soft at the knees, and work boots that belonged in a garage, not 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. His face carried the kind of tiredness that came from too many double shifts and not enough sleep, and his hands, rough, calloused, stained with what looked like engine grease he hadn't quite scrubbed away, rested protectively on a small backpack in his lap. Beside him, in the window seat, a little girl of maybe 6 or 7 clutched a stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide and worried as she stared out at the darkening sky. Victoria's jaw tightened. Business class. Her sanctuary. Invaded. She slid into her seat with the kind of pointed precision that announced her displeasure without requiring words. The man glanced at her briefly, offered a small nod, then returned his attention to his daughter, murmuring something soft that Victoria couldn't quite hear. The girl whispered back, "Daddy, what if the plane shakes again like last time?" "Then we'll hold hands and count clouds until it stops, Em, just like we practiced. You're the bravest girl I know." Victoria pulled out her laptop, opened it with unnecessary force, and began typing. The quarterly reports weren't going to review themselves, and she certainly wasn't going to waste time acknowledging the obvious mistake that had put this, she glanced sideways again, this mechanic and his child in seats that cost more than he probably made in a month. 20 minutes into the flight, the turbulence started. It began as gentle bumps, the kind that made drinks shiver in their cups and nervous flyers grip armrests. Victoria didn't flinch. She'd flown this route 17 times in the last 2 years alone. Turbulence was just air doing what air did. But the little girl didn't see it that way. "Daddy?" Her voice climbed into panic territory. "Daddy? It's shaking." "I know, sweetheart. It's okay. Remember what we talked about? The plane is stronger than any shake. We're going to be just fine." The man's voice remained steady, calm, the kind of calm that came from practice rather than genuine ease. He took his daughter's small hand in his larger, scarred one. "Let's count clouds. Can you see any out there? It's too dark. Then we'll count stars instead. I bet you can find at least 10 before the shaking stops. Victoria's fingers paused over her keyboard. Despite herself, she was listening. The turbulence intensified. The seatbelt sign dinged on. A flight attendant's voice, professionally cheerful, announced that everyone should return to their seats and buckle up. 1 star, Daddy. I found one. That's my girl. Keep going. 2 stars. They're really small. Victoria glanced sideways and saw the man's free hand gripping the armrest between them, knuckles white beneath the weathered skin. His jaw was clenched tight enough to crack teeth. He was terrified. But his daughter didn't know that, because he wouldn't let her know. The observation needled somewhere beneath Victoria's perfectly constructed indifference, but she pushed it away. She had quarterly projections to review, a merger to finalize, a board meeting that would determine whether Hale Dynamics expanded into 3 new markets or retreated into consolidation. She didn't have time for sentimentality about blue-collar fathers and their frightened children. The plane bucked hard. Victoria's laptop slid forward, and she caught it with practiced reflex. Around them, passengers gasped. Someone's drink tumbled into the aisle, ice cubes skittering like frightened mice. "Daddy!" The little girl's shriek cut through the cabin noise. "I've got you, Em. I've got you. Nothing's going to happen. You're safe with me." Victoria snapped. She couldn't help herself. The words came out before her better judgment could stop them. Not that her better judgment had ever been particularly interested in stopping her before. "Perhaps if you'd purchased appropriate seating, your daughter wouldn't be so terrified right now," she said, her voice carrying that particular Upper East Side clip that could flay skin at 20 paces. "Business class is meant for business travelers, not—" She gestured vaguely at the man's worn jacket, his daughter's rumpled clothes, the stuffed rabbit that had definitely seen better days. "Not family emergencies that belong in economy where they can't disturb people trying to work." The man turned to look at her fully for the first time. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds over the Atlantic, and they held something she couldn't quite name. Not anger, not even surprise. Just a kind of weary recognition, as if he'd heard all of this before and had long since stopped being surprised by human cruelty. "I apologize if we've disturbed you," he said quietly. "Emma gets nervous when we fly. We'll keep it down." That was it. No defense, no explanation. Just an apology she hadn't earned and a promise to become even more invisible. It should have satisfied her. It didn't. "See that you do," Victoria said anyway, and returned to her laptop screen, where numbers and projections made sense in ways people never did. Beside her, the man leaned down to his daughter. "Remember what I said about counting stars, sweetheart? Let's get all the way to 20 this time." "Okay, Daddy." The girl's voice was smaller now, embarrassed. She'd understood enough of Victoria's words to know they'd been unwelcome. "I'm sorry I was too loud." "You weren't too loud, Em. You were just right. You're always just right." The turbulence continued for another 15 minutes, and through it all, Ryan Mercer counted stars with his daughter in a voice so gentle it made Victoria's chest feel strange and tight in ways she didn't have names for and refused to examine. When the shaking finally subsided and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Victoria closed her laptop. She'd read the same paragraph 7 times and absorbed none of it. Instead, she'd been disturbingly aware of the quiet conversation happening inches from her shoulder, the patience in the man's voice, the way his daughter's panic had gradually dissolved into something that almost resembled excitement as she'd found star after imaginary star in the darkness beyond her window. 23 stars, Daddy! I found 23! You sure did, sweetheart. I told you that you were brave. Victoria stood abruptly, grabbed her bag from the overhead compartment with more force than necessary, and stalked toward the bathroom. She needed space. She needed to not hear that gentleness anymore, that patience, that love that asked for nothing and gave everything. In the cramped bathroom, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, perfect armor that suddenly felt thinner than it ever had before. She splashed cold water on her wrists, an old trick her mother had taught her before everything had fallen apart, and told herself she was being ridiculous. So what if the man was kind to his daughter? That didn't change anything. He was still in the wrong place, still disrupting her work, still everything her world had taught her to dismiss. When she returned to her seat, the cabin was quieter. Dinner service had begun, and the flight attendant was working her way down the aisle with practiced efficiency. Ryan Mercer was reading to his daughter from a battered paperback, something about dragons and princesses that Victoria wouldn't have touched with a 10-foot pole. But Emma's eyes were wide with wonder, her earlier fear completely forgotten. The flight attendant reached their row. "Dinner service, ma'am?" She smiled at Victoria with professional warmth. "We have the herb-crusted salmon, or the beef tenderloin tonight." "Salmon," Victoria said without looking up from her phone, where she was scrolling through emails that could have waited but felt safer than paying attention to her surroundings. "And for you, sir?" Ryan glanced up from his book. "Whatever's easiest. I'm not picky." "We'll take the chicken tenders for the little one?" The flight attendant smiled at Emma. "I think I have some extra cookies hidden away too, if that's okay with Dad." "That's very kind of you," Ryan said, and Victoria could hear genuine gratitude in his voice, the kind that came from not expecting kindness and being surprised when it appeared. After the attendant moved on, Emma tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy, she was nice." "Yes, she was, sweetheart." Not like the angry lady. Victoria's hand tightened around her phone. She shouldn't have heard that. She shouldn't have cared. Ryan's voice dropped lower, but Victoria still caught it. Sometimes people have hard days, and it comes out in ways that aren't very kind. But that doesn't mean we stop being kind ourselves, okay? We just keep being who we are no matter how other people act. Even when they're mean? Especially then. That's when kindness matters most. Victoria closed her eyes. She wanted to feel anger, indignation, the righteous fury that had carried her through 1,000 boardroom battles. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to shame. The meal came and went. Victoria picked at her salmon without tasting it. Beside her, Ryan helped Emma cut her chicken tenders into careful bites, wiped sauce from her chin, and never once asked for anything himself until his daughter was completely finished. Only then did he eat his own meal, cold by now, and Victoria noticed he ate it anyway without complaint. 2 hours into the flight, Emma fell asleep against her father's shoulder, the stuffed rabbit clutched in her arms, her face peaceful in the dim cabin light. Ryan sat very still, as if afraid any movement might wake her. His own eyes were tired, red-rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that spoke to weeks or months of insufficient sleep. Victoria found herself staring at his hands again. They were a working man's hands, scarred, calloused, the nails trimmed short and practical. They cradled his daughter with infinite gentleness, one palm cupped protectively around her small shoulder, the other resting lightly on her hair. Those hands had probably built things, fixed things, created things that mattered in ways Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers never had. She looked away, unsettled. The flight stretched on through the darkness. Most of the cabin slept. Victoria tried to work, tried to read, tried to do anything except notice the man beside her who'd remained unfailingly polite despite her cruelty, who'd comforted his daughter through her fear without ever showing his own, who'd taught a lesson about kindness that Victoria had spent 32 years successfully avoiding. She failed at all of it. Instead, she found herself wondering who he was, what he did, why he was flying to Zurich with a little girl and a backpack that looked like it had seen more of the world than most people ever would. She could have asked. Should have, maybe, if only to fill the strange silence that had settled between them like snow. But Victoria Hale didn't apologize, and she certainly didn't admit when she'd been wrong, so she said nothing. And the night continued its slow march toward morning, carrying them all toward a reckoning that Victoria Hale, in her perfect armor and her perfect confidence, had no idea was coming. Around 2 a.m., when most of the cabin was dark and quiet, Ryan shifted carefully, trying not to disturb his sleeping daughter. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, worn leather, held together with a rubber band, and began to write. Victoria shouldn't have looked, she knew that, but she did anyway. His handwriting was neat, precise, the kind that came from years of technical work that demanded accuracy. He wasn't writing words, she realized after a moment. He was sketching something. Diagrams. Mechanical drawings of some kind. Aircraft schematics, she realized with a start. Detailed, professional aircraft schematics. The man she'd dismissed as some blue-collar nobody was drawing technical diagrams that would have made her own aerospace engineers jealous. Couldn't sleep either? His voice was quiet, meant not to carry. Victoria started, caught. I don't require much sleep. 4 hours a night is standard for me. That must be exhausting. She bristled. I'm CEO of a $3.7 billion company. Exhaustion comes with the territory. It's called ambition. I'm familiar with ambition. He closed the notebook, slipped it back into his pocket. I used to think it was the most important thing, too. And what changed your mind? He glanced down at his daughter, still sleeping peacefully against his shoulder. I learned what actually matters when you're not there to see it anymore. When ambition costs you everything worth having, it stops looking like success and starts looking like the biggest mistake you ever made. Victoria wanted to argue, to defend the life she'd built, the empire she'd created from nothing. But something in his voice stopped her, a grief so deep and quiet it didn't need volume to carry weight. What happened? She asked before she could stop herself. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Then, I made a choice. The right choice, I think, even now. But it cost me my career, my wife, and 3 years of my daughter's life that I'll never get back. So now I make different choices. Smaller ones, maybe, but ones that let me wake up every morning and look Em in the eyes without feeling like I traded her for something that never mattered in the first place. That's very philosophical for a... She stopped herself, but not quickly enough. For a mechanic? He finished for her, no anger in his voice. Just that same quiet recognition. I am a mechanic. I fix things. Keep planes in the air. It's honest work, and it pays enough to keep Em fed and clothed and safe. That's all I need now. You could probably do more. With those... She gestured vaguely at his pocket where the notebook rested. Skills? I did do more once. Turned out more wasn't better, just louder. Before Victoria could respond, the plane shuddered. Not the gentle bump of earlier turbulence, but a violent sideways lurch that sent everyone's stomachs into their throats. Emma woke with a cry. Around the cabin, passengers gasped. Overhead compartments rattled. The lights flickered. Then came the sound, a grinding mechanical shriek that no plane should ever make, followed by a bang so loud Victoria felt it in her bones. The aircraft dropped, not the gentle descent of approach, but a stomach-lurching fall that made everything not bolted down leap toward the ceiling. Someone's phone flew past Victoria's head. A flight attendant slammed against the galley wall. Emergency oxygen masks deployed with a hiss, dropping from the ceiling like yellow plastic spiders. "Daddy!" Emma's scream cut through the chaos. "I've got you!" Ryan pulled the oxygen mask over his daughter's face with practiced precision, then reached for his own. "Breathe, sweetheart. Just breathe. I've got you. You're safe." Victoria grabbed her own mask with shaking hands, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Around them, passengers were screaming, praying, sobbing. The cabin tilted at an angle that should have been impossible. Through the windows, lightning split the darkness. They were in the storm now, deep in it, and the plane was bucking like a wild animal trying to throw its rider. The intercom crackled to life. The captain's voice came through, and for the first time in Victoria's extensive flying experience, she heard fear in a pilot's tone. "This is Captain Mitchell. We've experienced a catastrophic failure of our hydraulic systems and have lost our co-pilot to a medical emergency. I need all passengers to remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, take your seats immediately." The plane lurched again. Someone vomited. The smell of fear sweat filled the cabin, sharp and animal. Victoria gripped the armrest so hard her perfectly manicured nails bent backward. She'd faced down hostile boards, corporate raiders, competitors who'd wanted to destroy everything she'd built. But she'd never felt this absolute primal terror that came from being 30,000 feet above the ocean with only fragile metal and failing systems between her and oblivion. Beside her, Ryan had gone completely still. Not frozen. Still. The difference was subtle but crucial. His breathing had slowed, deepened. His hands remained gentle on Emma, but his eyes had changed. The weariness was gone, burned away by something else. Focus. Absolute, unwavering focus. The intercom crackled again. Captain Mitchell's voice was ragged now, desperate. "This is an emergency announcement. I need to know..." A pause heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. "Is there a fighter pilot on board this aircraft?" I repeat, is there a fighter pilot currently on board? If so, please identify yourself immediately to the flight crew. The cabin fell silent except for the storm battering the fuselage and the sound of people crying, praying, saying goodbye to loved ones they'd never see again. Victoria's heart stopped. She turned to look at Ryan Mercer, the man she'd mocked, dismissed, deemed unworthy of his seat, and watched as he closed his eyes, took one long breath, then kissed his daughter's forehead. I need you to be very brave for me right now. Can you do that? Daddy, I'm scared. I know, sweetheart. Me too. He unbuckled his seatbelt. But I need to go help the pilot for a little while. You're going to stay right here, and I promise, I will come back to you. No, Daddy, don't leave me. He cupped her face in his scarred, gentle hands. I love you more than anything in this entire world. Nothing is going to happen to you. Do you understand me? Nothing. I will always, always come back to you. Then he stood, pressed the call button for the flight attendant, and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of command Victoria had never heard from him before. Tell Captain Mitchell that Captain Ryan Mercer, formerly of the United States Air Force, is on board and reporting for duty. The flight attendant stared at him, eyes wide. Now, Ryan said, and it wasn't a request. She ran. Victoria sat frozen, oxygen mask pressed to her face, watching as the mechanic in the faded denim jacket walked toward the cockpit with the steady gait of a man who'd done this before, who'd walked toward fear instead of away from it, who'd given up everything once and was apparently prepared to do it all over again. Emma sobbed in the seat beside her, small and terrified and alone. And Victoria Hale, CEO of a $3.7 billion empire, reached over and took the little girl's hand. Your daddy's going to save us, she heard herself say, her voice strange and thick. He's going to save all of us. She didn't know if it was true, but she needed it to be. The cockpit door opened. Ryan Mercer disappeared inside, and the plane, carrying 247 souls, pitched into darkness toward whatever ending was waiting below. The cockpit door sealed behind Ryan with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like a tomb closing. Victoria stared at that door, her hand still clasping Emma's smaller one, and felt the full weight of what she'd done settling onto her chest like concrete. She'd mocked this man, belittled him, dismissed him as beneath her notice. And now he was the only thing standing between 247 people and the Atlantic Ocean 30,000 feet below. Emma's hand trembled in hers, small and cold, and desperately trusting in a way Victoria hadn't earned. The little girl was staring at the cockpit door, too, tears streaming down her face, her stuffed rabbit clutched so tightly against her chest that its threadbare ears were crumpling. He promised he'd come back, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm battering the fuselage. He always keeps his promises. Victoria wanted to say something comforting, something maternal and warm, but the words stuck in her throat. She'd spent 32 years building walls between herself and this kind of vulnerability, and she didn't know how to tear them down, even when a child needed her to. So instead, she just held on tighter. The plane lurched again, dropping what felt like 1,000 feet in a single heartbeat. Screams erupted around them. Someone's luggage exploded from an overhead compartment, scattering clothes and toiletries across the aisle. The emergency lights strobed, casting everything in hellish red and shadow. Through it all, Victoria kept her eyes on that cockpit door and tried not to think about the fact that she'd put her life in the hands of a man she'd spent the last 3 hours treating like human garbage. Inside the cockpit, Ryan Mercer gripped the door frame and took in a scene that would have sent most civilians into immediate panic. Captain Mitchell hunched over the controls, his face gray with exhaustion and fear, both hands wrestling with a yoke that clearly wasn't responding the way it should. To his right, the co-pilot's seat sat empty. The man himself slumped against the bulkhead with a flight attendant kneeling beside him, checking his pulse with shaking hands. The instrument panel looked like a Christmas tree designed by a sadist. Every warning light blazing red, alarms screaming in discordant harmony, and the artificial horizon spinning in ways that said the aircraft had no idea which way was up anymore. "Captain Mitchell," Ryan said, his voice cutting through the chaos with the kind of calm that came from training so deep it bypassed conscious thought. "Captain Ryan Mercer reporting. Where do you need me?" Mitchell's head snapped around, and Ryan saw the desperate hope in the older man's eyes, the look of a drowning man who'd just spotted a piece of driftwood. Jesus Christ, you're actually real. Tell me you've got recent flight hours. Last time I flew was 3 years ago, but I've got 5,000 hours in F-15ES and another 2,000 in commercial simulators. Ryan was already moving toward the co-pilot's seat, his body remembering the choreography even as his mind tried to catalog everything wrong with the picture in front of him. What's our situation? Complete hydraulic failure on the number 2 system, partial failure on number 1. We've lost most of our flight controls. The stick's responding maybe 30%, and I've got no idea how long that's going to last. Mitchell's voice cracked slightly. And my co-pilot had what looks like a stroke about 5 minutes before everything went to hell. We're at 32,000 feet, 200 miles from the nearest airport, flying blind through a storm that's ripping us apart. And I've got 247 souls on board who are counting on me to get them down alive. Ryan slid into the co-pilot seat and pulled the harness tight across his chest with practiced efficiency. His hands found the controls, and muscle memory 3 years dormant roared back to life. What about emergency systems? Limited. We've got manual reversion on some controls, but it's like trying to steer a freight train with a bicycle chain. Mitchell shot him a look that was equal parts gratitude and terror. I hope you're as good as your record suggests, Captain. What do you know about my record? Nothing, but you said you'd fly F-15S, and nobody flies Eagles unless they're either crazy or brilliant. I'm praying for brilliant right now. Ryan's jaw tightened. I got drummed out of the Air Force for insubordination. My last mission ended with me disobeying direct orders and crashing a $40 million aircraft into the side of a mountain. So maybe temper your expectations, Captain. Did people die? No. Then you're exactly what I need. Mitchell's hands were white-knuckled on the yoke. Because right now, I'll take a pilot who breaks rules to save lives over one who follows them straight into the ocean. Another violent shudder ripped through the aircraft. Ryan's hands flew across the instrument panel, his eyes scanning readouts with the speed of someone who'd done this 10,000 times in conditions far worse than turbulence and failing hydraulics. His mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating angles and speeds and probabilities with the cold precision that had made him one of the youngest fighter captains in his squadron. Okay, he said, his voice dropping into that strange calm that always came over him when things got bad enough. Here's what we're going to do. We need to get out of this storm first. It's tearing us apart, and we don't have the control authority to fight it. What's our heading? 095, but we're drifting. I can't hold it steady. Don't try. Let her drift. We're going to use what's left of the hydraulics to make one big turn instead of fighting for every degree. Banking right, descending to get under this weather. How's our fuel? Mitchell checked the gauge. Enough for another 4 hours at current consumption, but if we descend, we'll burn faster. Can't be helped. We can't land if we're in pieces. Ryan's hands moved with surgical precision, coaxing the dying aircraft into a gentle right bank. The plane resisted, shuddering like a wounded animal, but slowly, agonizingly slowly, the nose began to swing. Talk me through the hydraulic failures. What exactly happened? Number 2 system just died. No warning, no degradation. 1 second it was green, the next it was gone. Number 1 started fluctuating about 30 seconds later. I think we took a lightning strike that fried something critical. Ryan's mind raced through the possibilities. Modern aircraft had redundancy built on redundancy, but if lightning had hit just right, if it had found the one weak point in a system designed to survive nearly anything. What about the Rat? He asked, referring to the Ram air turbine, the emergency power system that deployed like a small windmill into the airstream. Already deployed, it's giving us partial power but not enough for full authority. Then we work with what we've got. Ryan eased the yoke forward, feeling the aircraft's reluctant response. I'm taking us down to 20,000. The air's thicker there. We'll have better control surface response even with degraded hydraulics. The storm extends down to 15,000. I know, but we're dead if we stay up here. Ryan's voice remained absolutely level, and somewhere in the back of his mind he registered the familiar feeling of everything else falling away. The fear, the regret, the 3 years of grief and failure, until there was nothing but the aircraft and the problem and the solution he had to find before time ran out. Captain, I need you to work the throttles while I handle pitch and bank. We're going to fly this bird like it's 30 years old and made of wood and wire. Gentle inputs, patient corrections. Can you do that? Mitchell nodded, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. What about landing? Even if we get through this storm, we'll need a long runway and perfect conditions to put her down without full hydraulics. One problem at a time, Captain. Right now, our problem is not dying in the next 5 minutes. We'll worry about dying in the next hour after we've solved that. The gallows humor hung in the air between them for a second, then Mitchell actually laughed. A short, sharp bark of sound that said he recognized a kindred spirit. Someone who'd learned to joke about death because the alternative was letting it paralyze you. They worked in tandem, two men who'd never met before the world started ending, finding a rhythm as old as aviation itself. Mitchell handled power, Ryan handled flight path, and between them they coaxed the dying aircraft into a descent that was equal parts controlled fall and barely managed disaster. The storm didn't want to let them go. Wind shear slammed into them from 3 directions at once. Lightning forked across the windscreen, close enough that Ryan could smell ozone. Hail hammered the fuselage with sounds like machine gun fire, and Ryan knew that somewhere back in the cabin, people were losing their minds with terror, including his daughter. The thought tried to break his concentration, but he shoved it down with brutal efficiency. Emma needed him to be Captain Mercer right now, not Dad. She needed him to fly this plane like he'd flown eagles through hostile airspace over mountains where one mistake meant death. She needed him to be the man he'd been before everything fell apart, even if that man had cost him everything. 1,500 feet per minute descent, Mitchell called out, reading the instruments. Airspeed 180 and dropping. We're below recommended minimum for this altitude. It's the best we're going to get with half our hydraulics gone. Any slower and we'll fall out of the sky. Any faster, and we'll rip the wings off. Ryan's hands made micro-adjustments, feeling through the controls for the aircraft's responses. How's the rat power holding? Steady at 60%. Not great, but not getting worse. Small miracles. Ryan risked a glance at the weather radar. The storm cell was massive, but they were approaching its southern edge. Another few minutes, and they'd be through. Start thinking about diversion airports. We're not making Zurich with these systems. We need somewhere with long runways, good emergency services, and weather clear enough to attempt a manual landing. Mitchell was already pulling up the charts on his display. Shannon in Ireland is closest. Runway is 9,000 feet. Emergency services rated Category 10. Weather is, he checked the data stream. Low clouds but no precipitation. Wind out of the west at 15 knots. That'll work. How far? At current speed and descent rate, about 40 minutes. Ryan did the math in his head. Fuel, distance, descent profile, approach path with limited controls. It was going to be tight. Everything was going to have to go perfectly, which meant everything was probably going to go wrong. Radio Shannon, tell them we're declaring an emergency and we'll need every piece of equipment they've got standing by. Full foam on the runway, ambulances, the works. And tell them, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Tell them we're coming in heavy with degraded flight controls and our landing is going to be fast and hard. They should clear everything within a mile of the approach path. Mitchell's hand hesitated over the radio switch. That bad? Honestly, Captain, I have no idea. I've never landed anything this size with failed hydraulics, but I'd rather prepare for the worst and be pleasantly surprised than the other way around. Fair enough. Mitchell keyed the radio. Shannon Tower, this is Atlas Air Flight 2847. We are declaring an emergency, requesting priority approach and full emergency services. While Mitchell handled communications, Ryan continued the delicate dance of keeping them in the air. The plane was fighting him now. Every input met with sluggish resistance or, worse, delayed response that made precise control nearly impossible. It was like trying to thread a needle while wearing boxing gloves in an earthquake. He'd done harder. 3 years ago, with an F-15 that had taken missile damage and lost half its tail assembly, he'd managed to keep the aircraft flying long enough to guide it away from the refugee camp it had been falling toward. Of course, that act of heroism had also meant disobeying direct orders to eject, had cost the Air Force $40 million when he'd finally crashed into uninhabited mountainside, and had earned him a court-martial that ended his career. But nobody had died that day. He'd take the same deal now if someone offered it. Shannon confirms emergency services are mobilizing, Mitchell reported. They're giving us priority approach and clearing all other traffic. We're cleared direct to the field when ready. Not yet. I want to be at 10,000 and stable before we start the approach. We only get one shot at this. The descent continued. 25,000 feet. 20,000. The air grew thicker, and the controls became fractionally more responsive. Not much, maybe 5%, 10 at most, but every bit helped. Then the number one hydraulic system flickered. Ryan saw it in his peripheral vision, the gauge dipping from 40% to 30, then bouncing back up to 35. His stomach went cold. "Did you see that?" Mitchell's voice was tight. "I saw it. How long until it fails completely?" "No way to know. Could be 5 minutes, could be 5 seconds, could stabilize and last until we're on the ground." So we assume 5 minutes and work accordingly. Ryan adjusted their descent rate slightly, stealing a few hundred feet per minute. They'd hit 10,000 faster now, but with less margin for error. "Start running the approach checklist. I want to be ready to land the second we're in position." Mitchell pulled out the Emergency Procedures Handbook, a tome thick as a Bible, and started flipping through pages. Manual landing with hydraulic failure. Okay, here we go. Says we need to configure early, maintain high speed on approach, expect limited flare capability, and plan for a firm touchdown. Firm is a polite way of saying we're going to hit like a bag of cement dropped from a building. The manual doesn't use those exact words. The manual wasn't written by someone who's done it. Ryan's eyes never left the instruments. "We'll configure flaps at 5 miles out, gear down at 3 miles, and I'll hold speed at 160 until the last possible second. When we cross the threshold, I'll pull power and pray." "That's your whole plan? Pray? You have a better one?" Mitchell was quiet for a moment, then, No, I really don't." They broke through the bottom of the storm at 18,000 feet, and suddenly the world made sense again. Below them, the North Atlantic stretched dark and endless, dotted with whitecaps that looked like stars from this altitude. The clouds above were angry and roiling, but they were above, and that was all that mattered. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mitchell." The captain's voice went out over the PA system, reaching back into the cabin where Victoria still sat clutching Emma's hand. "We've successfully navigated through the worst of the weather and are beginning our approach to Shannon Airport in Ireland. We will be landing in approximately 30 minutes. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all loose items are secured. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing procedures." In the cabin, the announcement landed like a bomb. Emergency landing procedures. Victoria watched as flight attendants moved through the aisles with grim efficiency, demonstrating brace positions and checking that everyone understood what was about to happen. The professional calm in their voices didn't quite hide the fear in their eyes. "Is Daddy still flying the plane?" Emma asked, her voice small and scared. Victoria looked at the little girl, really looked at her for the first time. She had her father's gray eyes, and they held the same quiet strength Victoria had seen in Ryan's face when he'd counted stars through her panic. This child had learned courage from a man Victoria had dismissed as worthless. "Yes," Victoria said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "Your daddy is flying the plane, and he's going to get us down safe." "How do you know?" "Because he's the kind of man who teaches his daughter to count stars in a storm. Because he stayed calm when I was cruel. Because he walked toward danger instead of away from it. Because everything I thought I knew about worth and value was wrong." But Victoria didn't say any of that. Instead, she squeezed Emma's hand and said simply, "Because he promised you he'd come back. And you said he always keeps his promises." Emma nodded slowly, then leaned against Victoria's shoulder in a gesture of trust that made Victoria's throat close up. She'd never been good with children, had never wanted them, had built her life around the principle that family was a weakness she couldn't afford. But sitting here in a dying plane with a terrified little girl pressed against her side, Victoria felt something shift in her chest, something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten it was there. In the cockpit, Ryan and Mitchell were running through the approach checklist with the methodical precision of men who knew that missing even one step could kill everyone aboard. Fuel check. 3,000 pounds. Enough for one approach, maybe one go-around if we're lucky. "We won't be going around, it's this or nothing." Ryan adjusted his heading slightly. Distance to field? 40 miles. Shannon has us on radar and is vectoring us in. Altimeter setting? 299 Set. Ryan's hands were steady on the controls, but inside his chest, his heart hammered with a rhythm he recognized from combat missions over hostile territory. This was the feeling of knowing you were about to do something impossibly difficult with everyone's life, depending on you getting it exactly right. He'd hated this feeling once, had run from it for 3 years, content to fix planes on the ground, where the only life at risk was his own. But sitting here now, with Emma and 246 other souls counting on him, he remembered why he'd loved it too. This moment when everything crystallized down to pure skill and nerve, and the refusal to quit even when quitting would be so much easier. Shannon Tower, Atlas 2847, we have the field in sight, Mitchell transmitted. Atlas 2847, Shannon Tower, you are cleared for approach runway 24. Wind 240 at 15 knots. Emergency equipment is standing by. Ryan could see the runway now, a ribbon of lights in the darkness. It looked impossibly small from this altitude, impossibly far away. Between here and there lay 1,000 things that could go wrong. He pushed the thought away and focused on what he could control. 5 miles, Mitchell called. Configure for landing? Flaps 15. Ryan reached for the flap lever, praying the limited hydraulics would respond. The indicator crawled downward with agonizing slowness, but it moved. Flaps are coming down. Speed is bleeding off. 170, 165, 160. The aircraft's nose pitched up slightly as the flaps deployed, and Ryan corrected with gentle forward pressure on the yoke. Every input had to be smooth, progressive, no sudden movements. The plane was a wounded bird held together by prayers and minimal hydraulics. One wrong move and it would fall apart. 3 miles, gear down, gear down. Mitchell moved the gear lever, and somewhere beneath them, massive wheels deployed into the slipstream with a rumble they could feel through the airframe. 3 green lights illuminated on the panel. Gear down and locked, Mitchell confirmed. 1 mile to threshold, speed 160. Hold it there. Ryan's world had narrowed to the runway ahead, the instruments before him, and the feel of the aircraft through his hands. Everything else, the fear, the exhaustion, the weight of responsibility, faded into background noise. Talk me down, Captain. I need eyes outside while I watch the gauges. 500 feet, on glide path, 400, slightly left of centerline, 300. Speed is good, 200. Drifting right, correct right. Ryan's hands moved fractionally, and the aircraft responded with maddening sluggishness. Come on, sweetheart. Work with me here. 100 feet, centerline is good. 50 feet, 30, 20, 10. Ryan pulled the throttles to idle and hauled back on the yoke with everything he had. The aircraft's nose came up, but not nearly enough. They were coming in fast and hard, and there was nothing left to do but hold on. The main landing gear hit the runway with a bang like a bomb going off. The aircraft bounced, once, twice, then slammed down again hard enough to rattle teeth. Ryan stood on the brake pedals, feeling limited response, and watched the runway lights blur past at terrifying speed. They were still going way too fast. Full reverse thrust, he shouted. Mitchell had already moved, his hands slamming the throttles into reverse. The engine screamed in protest, and the aircraft shuddered violently as competing forces tried to tear it apart. 6,000 feet of runway left. 5,000. 4,000. They weren't slowing fast enough. Ryan pumped the brakes, coaxing every bit of friction from tires that were probably on fire by now. The end of the runway was rushing toward them, and beyond it he could see grass and dirt and disaster. 3,000 feet, 2,000. Come on, he growled through clenched teeth. Come on, come on, come on. 1,000 feet. The aircraft finally began to decelerate in earnest. 500 feet. The speed bled off from highway speeds to residential street speeds to something approaching survivable. At 200 feet from the end of the runway, they stopped. For a long moment, nobody in the cockpit moved. Then Mitchell let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it for the last 30 minutes. Holy Mother of God, he whispered. We're alive. We're actually alive. Ryan's hands were still gripping the yoke so hard his knuckles had gone white. He had to consciously force his fingers to open, to release the controls that had become an extension of his body for the last 45 minutes. Yeah, he said, his voice rough and strange. "We are." Behind them, in the cabin, the silence broke. Someone started crying. Then someone else. Then the entire plane erupted in applause and sobs and prayers of gratitude in a dozen different languages. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, Emma still pressed against her shoulder, and felt tears streaming down her face. Tears she hadn't cried in 20 years. Tears she didn't know she still had in her. Tears for a life she'd almost lost, and a man she'd almost destroyed with her cruelty. The cockpit door opened and Ryan Mercer emerged. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 45 minutes. His face was gray with exhaustion, his hands were shaking, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd just walked through fire and barely made it out the other side. But he was alive. And the first thing he did, before the congratulations, before the questions, before anything else, was stumble down the aisle to where his daughter sat waiting. "Daddy!" Emma tore herself from Victoria's grasp and launched herself into her father's arms. Ryan caught her, held her, buried his face in her hair, and just breathed. His whole body was trembling now, the adrenaline finally wearing off and leaving nothing but exhaustion and overwhelming relief in its wake. "I told you I'd come back," he whispered against his daughter's hair. "I told you, sweetheart. I always come back." Victoria watched them, and something inside her chest cracked open. Something that had been sealed shut for so long she'd forgotten it existed. Shame washed over her in waves, hot and suffocating, as she remembered every cruel word she'd said to this man who'd just saved her life. Ryan looked up and met her eyes over Emma's head. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the CEO and the mechanic, the woman who'd had everything and the man who'd given up everything. Two people who should never have met except for the accident of assigned seating and a storm that had tried to kill them all. Victoria opened her mouth. She should say something. Apologize. Thank him. Beg his forgiveness for her inexcusable cruelty. But before she could find the words, the emergency services crews were flooding onto the plane, and the moment shattered into chaos and relief, and the messy aftermath of disaster narrowly avoided. Ryan turned away, carrying Emma toward the exit, and Victoria was left sitting alone in her seat, watching him go and wondering if she'd just missed her only chance to make things right. Outside the aircraft, the Irish dawn was breaking over Shannon Airport, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Inside Victoria Hale's perfectly constructed world, something fundamental had broken, and she had no idea how to put it back together. The terminal at Shannon Airport had been transformed into controlled chaos. Emergency personnel moved through the crowded space with practiced efficiency, triaging passengers, checking vital signs, asking the same questions over and over in calm professional voices that couldn't quite mask the underlying amazement that everyone had walked away alive. Victoria stood near the windows overlooking the tarmac, watching crews swarm around the aircraft they'd just evacuated. Even from here, she could see the damage, scoring along the fuselage where lightning had struck. One of the engine cowlings partially separated, and landing gear that looked like it had been through a war zone. The fact that Ryan had put that broken bird on the ground with everyone breathing was nothing short of miraculous. She'd been trying to find him for the last 20 minutes, but he disappeared into the maze of emergency services, still carrying Emma, and Victoria had lost track of them in the confusion. Now she stood alone with her designer luggage and her $3.7 billion empire, feeling more lost than she'd ever felt in her life. "Ms. Hale?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find a woman in an airline uniform approaching, tablet in hand and exhaustion written across her features. "I'm Caroline Shaw, Atlas Air's station manager here in Shannon. I wanted to personally check on you and ensure you have everything you need." "I'm fine," Victoria said automatically, the response so practiced it required no thought. "When can we continue to Zurich?" Caroline's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise. "I'm afraid that won't be possible today, Ms. Hale. All passengers from Flight 2847 are being held for mandatory medical evaluation and debriefing. We're arranging hotel accommodations and meals, and we'll work on rebooking everyone once the authorities have cleared us to proceed." "That's unacceptable. I have meetings in Zurich that cannot be delayed." "I understand, but this is non-negotiable. Air accident investigation protocols require—" "I don't care what protocols require." Victoria's voice took on the edge that made boardrooms fall silent. "I need to be in Zurich by tomorrow morning. and I expect your airline to make that happen." Caroline's professional mask didn't crack, but Victoria saw her jaw tighten slightly. "I'll see what I can arrange, Ms. Hale. In the meantime, there's a gentleman asking to speak with you. He says it's urgent." Victoria frowned. "Who?" "He didn't give his name, just said you'd want to hear what he has to say." Caroline gestured toward a quieter corner of the terminal where a man in a weathered flight jacket stood waiting, his back to them as he stared out at the damaged aircraft. Even from behind, Victoria recognized the set of those shoulders, the way he held himself with unconscious military bearing despite the civilian clothes. Her stomach did something complicated and unwelcome. "Fine," she said, more curtly than intended. "I'll speak with him." She crossed the terminal with her usual confident stride, heels clicking against tile. But the closer she got to Ryan Mercer, the more that confidence began to feel like armor that no longer fit quite right. He turned as she approached, and Victoria saw that Emma was asleep in a nearby chair, wrapped in a blanket someone had provided. Her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. Ryan had positioned himself between his daughter and the rest of the terminal, still protecting her even in safety. "Mr. Mercer," Victoria said, then realized how absurdly formal that sounded, given that this man had just saved her life. "I mean, Ryan, I've been looking for you." "Have you?" It wasn't a question, and his tone was carefully neutral. "I'm surprised. I figured you'd want to pretend the last few hours never happened." The words hit harder than they should have. Victoria felt her defenses rising automatically, the old patterns reasserting themselves. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Ryan's gray eyes met hers steadily, and there was no anger in them, just a bone-deep weariness that made him look older than his years. "Because in my experience, people like you don't much enjoy being reminded that people like me can be useful." "People like me?" Victoria's voice went cold. "You don't know anything about me. I know you spent 3 hours making it very clear what you thought of me and my daughter. I know you believe your business class seat and your expensive suit make you better than the working man sitting next to you." He paused, and something shifted in his expression. "I also know that when everything went to hell, you held Emma's hand and told her I'd save us. So maybe I don't know you as well as I thought I did." The words hung between them, and Victoria found herself unable to meet his gaze. She looked instead at Emma, sleeping peacefully despite everything that had happened. Her small face relaxed in the way only children could manage after trauma. "I wanted to thank you," Victoria said finally, the words feeling awkward and insufficient in her mouth, "for what you did. You saved all of our lives." "I did my job." "Your job is aircraft mechanic, not pilot. You didn't have to go into that cockpit." "Yes, I did." Ryan's voice was quiet but absolute. "Because Emma was on that plane, and I'd walk through fire before I'd let anything happen to her. Everyone else was just fortunate enough to benefit from that fact." Victoria flinched at the casual dismissal, but she supposed she'd earned it. "Still, what you did was extraordinary. I've already contacted my office and arranged for a reward. $500,000 will be transferred to—" "No." The single word cut through her sentence like a blade. Ryan's expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had gone very hard. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, genuinely confused. "I'm offering you money. A substantial amount. Most people would be grateful." "Most people aren't me." Ryan crossed his arms, a defensive gesture that said this conversation was veering into territory he didn't want to explore. "I don't want your money, Ms. Hale. I don't want your gratitude or your guilt or whatever it is you're trying to purchase with that $500,000. I'm not trying to purchase anything. I'm trying to say thank you in the only language I know." "Then learn a different language." The words came out harder than Ryan seemed to intend, because he closed his eyes briefly and took a breath before continuing. "Look, I appreciate that you're trying, I really do, but you can't throw money at this and make it go away. You were cruel to a scared little girl and the father trying to comfort her. You made assumptions about our worth based on our clothes and our seats and our place in whatever hierarchy you use to organize the world, and now you want to write a check and feel better about it." Each word landed like a physical blow, and Victoria felt her face burning. "That's not— I didn't—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "You're right. You're absolutely right. And I'm sorry. I was cruel and dismissive, and I judged you based on superficial nonsense that doesn't matter. I have no excuse." Ryan looked at her for a long moment, surprise flickering across his features. I didn't expect you to admit that. Why not? Because in my experience, people who build empires worth billions don't get there by admitting when they're wrong. The observation cut deeper than any insult could have. Victoria wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come because he was right about that too. She'd built Hale Dynamics by being ruthless, by never showing weakness, by crushing anyone who got in her way. Apologies were for people who couldn't afford to be strong. Except right now, standing in front of this man who'd saved her life while she'd been busy despising him, strength felt like the loneliest thing in the world. I want to make this right, she said quietly. Tell me how. Ryan shook his head slowly. You can't. Some things don't get fixed, Ms. Hale. They just are. You learn from them and you move on. That's not good enough. It's going to have to be. He glanced back at Emma, still sleeping. I need to get my daughter somewhere quiet where she can rest properly. We've been through enough for one day. Wait. Victoria reached out without thinking, her hand stopping just short of touching his arm. At least let me arrange proper accommodations for you both. A hotel suite, meals, whatever you need while we're stuck here. The airline is already arranging a basic room and airport food. Victoria felt herself slipping back into familiar territory, the world of logistics and arrangements where she actually knew how to function. Let me do this. Not as payment, not as guilt money, just as a basic human courtesy from one person to another. Ryan studied her face, looking for something Victoria wasn't sure she possessed. Finally, he nodded. Okay, but nothing excessive. Just a safe, quiet place for Emma to recover. She doesn't need a palace. Understood. Victoria pulled out her phone and fired off 3 quick texts to her assistant. The Drummerland Castle is about 20 minutes from here. I'll have them prepare a family suite with whatever amenities a 6-year-old might need. Toys, books, anything to help her feel secure. That's a castle. I said nothing excessive. It's a hotel that happens to be in a castle. There's a difference. Victoria allowed herself a small smile. And before you argue, I'm staying there too. The airline put me there before all of this happened, and I'm not changing plans just to make you feel better about accepting help. Ryan's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. You're manipulative. You know that? I'm a CEO. It comes with the territory. The words came out lighter than Victoria had intended, almost playful, and she saw Ryan's expression shift in response. I suppose it does. He looked at his daughter again, and his whole face softened in a way that made Victoria's chest ache. Thank you, sincerely. Emma will appreciate having something nice after the day we've had. It's the least I can do. Victoria hesitated, then added, I really am sorry. For everything I said on the plane, you and Emma deserved better than that. Yeah, we did. Ryan met her eyes again, and this time there was something different in his gaze. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the possibility of it somewhere down the line. But you're trying now, and that counts for something. Before Victoria could respond, a man in a suit approached them with the purposeful stride of someone on official business. Captain Mercer, I'm Daniel O'Brien with the Irish Air Accident Investigation Unit. I need to ask you some questions about the landing. Ryan's entire demeanor changed, shoulders squaring, exhaustion temporarily pushed aside by ingrained military discipline. Of course. Let me wake my daughter, and actually, we've arranged for childcare if you'd prefer. This may take several hours, and I imagine your daughter has been through quite enough already. Ryan looked torn, glancing between Emma and the investigator. Victoria recognized the expression, the terrible calculus of a single parent trying to be everywhere at once and never quite managing it. I can stay with her, Victoria heard herself say. The words came out before her brain had fully processed them, and both men turned to stare at her in surprise. I mean, if you're comfortable with that, I'll be here anyway, and she knows me from the flight. You want to babysit my daughter? Ryan's tone suggested he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. I want to help. And despite what you might think, I'm not completely incompetent with children. That was a lie. Victoria had approximately 0 experience with children and even less idea what to do with one. But she'd figure it out. She'd built a billion-dollar company from nothing. She could handle one small girl for a few hours. Ryan studied her face for a long moment, and Victoria forced herself not to look away from that penetrating gray gaze. Finally, he turned to the investigator. Give me a moment. He crossed to where Emma slept and knelt beside her chair, gently shaking her shoulder. Em, sweetheart, wake up for me. Emma's eyes fluttered open, confused and disoriented. Daddy, where are we? We're safe, baby. We're in Ireland, remember? The plane landed and everyone's okay. Ryan brushed hair back from her forehead with infinite tenderness. I need to go talk to some people about what happened, but I don't want you to be alone. Would you be okay staying with Ms. Hale for a little while? Emma's gaze shifted to Victoria, and the child's expression was heartbreakingly uncertain. The angry lady? Victoria felt like she'd been punched. I wasn't... She stopped, took a breath. I was angry on the plane, Emma. You're right. But I'm not angry now, and I'd really like to keep you company while your dad is busy. We could get some food, maybe find you some toys or games. Will you be mean again? The question was so direct, so childishly honest, that Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes for the second time that day. No, sweetheart. I promise I won't be mean again. I'm very sorry I was mean before. Emma looked at her father, seeking guidance. Ryan nodded. Ms. Hale is going to take good care of you, Em, and I'll be back before you know it. Okay? Okay, Daddy. Emma stood on unsteady legs, still clutching her rabbit, and let Ryan pull her into a fierce hug. I love you more than anything in the world, he whispered against her hair. More than flying, more than anything, you remember that. I love you too, Daddy. Ryan straightened, brushed a hand across his eyes in a gesture that was almost too quick to catch, then turned to Victoria. His expression was carefully neutral, but his voice carried an edge of steel. If anything happens to her, nothing will happen to her, Victoria said firmly. You have my word. Your word. Ryan's tone suggested he wasn't sure what that was worth, but he was out of options and time. All right, her rabbit is called Mr. Hoppy. She doesn't go anywhere without him. She likes peanut butter sandwiches with the crust cut off, and she gets nightmares sometimes about her mother, so if she seems upset, just hold her and tell her it's okay to be sad. The casual mention of Emma's mother, and the past tense implicit in Ryan's words, made Victoria's heart clench. I'll take care of her, she said quietly. I promise. Ryan nodded once, then followed the investigator toward a private conference room, looking back over his shoulder twice before the door closed behind them. Victoria and Emma stood in the middle of the terminal, staring at each other with mutual uncertainty. So, Victoria said, feeling more out of her depth than she'd felt in any boardroom negotiation. Are you hungry? Emma nodded, small and solemn. Then let's find you something to eat. 20 minutes later, they were sitting in the airport's nicest restaurant, which wasn't saying much, but it was quiet and had actual tablecloths, with Emma working her way through a grilled cheese sandwich that Victoria had ordered after the child had shaken her head at every other option on the menu. Victoria sipped coffee that was only marginally better than airplane fuel and watched Emma eat with the focused intensity of someone who needed the distraction. The child hadn't spoken since they'd sat down, and Victoria had no idea how to bridge that silence. Your rabbit is very nice, she finally said, feeling absurd. Mr. Hoppy, right? Emma looked up, surprised that Victoria had remembered. Daddy gave him to me when I was 3. Mommy said he was too worn out to keep, but Daddy fixed him. Your daddy seems good at fixing things. He fixes planes. He makes them safe so they don't fall out of the sky. Emma's small face was serious, and Victoria realized the child was trying to process what had happened in the only way she knew how. But our plane almost fell anyway. It did, Victoria agreed, deciding honesty was probably better than platitudes. It was very scary. I thought we were going to die. Emma's voice was small and matter-of-fact, the way children could be about terrible things. But then Daddy went to fly the plane and he saved us. He always saves people. Mommy said that's why he can't stop flying, even when it makes him sad. Victoria set down her coffee cup carefully. Your daddy doesn't fly anymore? Not real flying. He just fixes planes now. He says it's better because he gets to be with me. Emma took another bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. But I think he misses it. Sometimes he looks at planes taking off and his face gets the sad look. The casual observation from a 6-year-old cut deeper than any corporate analysis Victoria had ever received. She thought about Ryan in the cockpit, The way he'd moved with absolute confidence despite 3 years away from the controls. The way his hands had known exactly what to do, even when his mind must have been screaming with fear. "Can I ask you something, Emma?" Victoria leaned forward slightly. "Why did your daddy stop flying, if he loved it so much?" Emma's expression shuddered, the openness disappearing behind a wall that was far too sophisticated for her age. "I'm not supposed to talk about it. Daddy says some things are private family business." "You're absolutely right. I'm sorry for asking." Victoria felt ashamed of herself for trying to extract information from a child. "How about we talk about something else? Do you like to read?" Emma's face brightened slightly. "I love reading. Daddy reads to me every night. Right now we're reading about a girl who goes to a magic school." "That sounds wonderful. What's your favorite part?" For the next 30 minutes, Emma talked about books and school and her best friend Mia, who lived in their apartment building and was teaching her how to do cartwheels. Victoria listened, asked questions, and slowly began to see the bright, thoughtful child beneath the trauma of the day's events. She also began to understand exactly what kind of father Ryan Mercer was. Every story Emma told featured him, playing games, helping with homework, attending school events despite working double shifts, making up silly songs to help her remember multiplication tables. This was a man who'd rebuilt his entire life around his daughter's needs, who'd sacrificed his own dreams to give her stability. And Victoria had called him worthless. The shame sat in her stomach like lead, getting heavier with each new story. "Ms. Hale." Emma's voice pulled her back to the present. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why were you so mean on the plane? Did I do something wrong?" Victoria's breath caught. She could lie, deflect, give some easy answer that protected her pride. But looking into Emma's trusting gray eyes, so much like her father's, she found she couldn't do it. "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong at all. I was mean because I'm used to being in control, and when your fear made noise, it reminded me that I wasn't in control of the plane or the storm or anything that was happening. And instead of being kind about it, I took my own fear out on you and your daddy. That was wrong of me. And I'm very, very sorry." Emma considered this with the seriousness of a much older child. "Daddy says sometimes grown-ups forget to use their kind words when they're scared. Your daddy is a very wise man. He's the best daddy in the whole world." The conviction in Emma's voice was absolute. Even when he's sad, he's still the best. "Why is he sad, sweetheart?" Emma's face fell. "Because Mommy died, and it's his fault. That's what Grandma said. She said if Daddy hadn't been so selfish with his flying, Mommy would still be here." Victoria felt like she'd been hit by a truck. "Oh, Emma, but it's not true." Emma's voice rose, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Daddy isn't selfish. He gave up everything for me. He doesn't even fly anymore except he had to today because we were going to crash and everyone needed him and The child dissolved into sobs, and Victoria did the only thing she could think of. She moved around the table and pulled Emma into her arms, holding her the way she'd held no one in years, maybe decades. "It's okay," she murmured, the words Ryan had told her to use. "It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be scared. Your daddy loves you so much, Emma. So much." Emma cried against her shoulder, small body shaking with the force of emotions too big for a 6-year-old to hold. And Victoria held her, this child she'd dismissed hours ago, and felt something fundamental cracking open in her chest. All her life, she'd believed that worth came from achievement, from building empires and crushing competition and being stronger than everyone else. She'd measured value in dollars and power and the size of her corner office. But sitting here in an airport restaurant, holding a sobbing child who loved her father with fierce, uncomplicated devotion, Victoria understood that she'd spent 32 years measuring all the wrong things. When Emma's tears finally subsided, Victoria kept holding her, unwilling to let go of this small person who'd trusted her despite having every reason not to. Eventually, Emma pulled back, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "I'm sorry I cried on you," she said in a small voice. "Don't be sorry. Sometimes crying is exactly what we need to do." Victoria smoothed Emma's hair back from her face. "Feel better?" Emma nodded. "A little bit." "Good. Now, I think we should get you somewhere more comfortable. How would you like to stay in an actual castle tonight?" Emma's eyes went wide. A real castle? With towers and everything? With towers and everything. And I bet they have a library full of books, and probably some toys, and definitely the most comfortable bed you've ever slept in. For the first time since the plane had started falling, Emma smiled. It was a small, tentative smile, but it transformed her face completely. Can Mr. Hoppy come too? Mr. Hoppy definitely comes too. He's part of the family. Victoria arranged for a car, and within the hour they were pulling up the long tree-lined drive to Dromoland Castle. Emma pressed her face against the window, eyes huge as she took in the stone turrets and manicured gardens and the sheer impossible fairy tale scope of it all. "Daddy's going to love this," she breathed. "He's never stayed anywhere fancy before." "Neither have I," Victoria almost said, then realized how absurd that would sound. She'd stayed in 5-star hotels around the world, penthouses and luxury suites, and places that cost more per night than most people made in a month. But she'd never really stayed in any of them. She'd just existed in expensive rooms between meetings, alone with her laptop and her ambition and the hollow satisfaction of another deal closed. The suite the hotel had prepared was perfect. A large sitting room with a fireplace, 2 bedrooms connected by a shared bathroom, and windows overlooking gardens that looked like something out of a storybook. Someone had thoughtfully left a basket of toys and books on the coffee table, along with fresh fruit and pastries. Emma gravitated immediately to the books, settling onto the plush sofa with Mr. Hoppy and beginning to page through an illustrated collection of Irish fairy tales. Victoria watched her for a moment, then excused herself to the bedroom to make some calls. Her assistant answered on the first ring. "Ms. Hale, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Marcus. Listen, I need you to do something for me." "Of course. The Zurich meetings have been postponed until—" "Not the meetings. I need you to research someone. Ryan Mercer, formerly Captain Ryan Mercer of the United States Air Force. I want to know everything. His service record, why he left, what happened to his wife, all of it. And Marcus? Be discreet." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "May I ask why?" "No, just do it and send me everything you find within the next few hours." She ended the call and stood at the window, watching the Irish countryside fade into twilight. Somewhere in this building, Ryan was probably still being debriefed, reliving the worst moments of his day so that investigators could understand what had gone wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. And somewhere in the sitting room, his daughter was reading about magic and castles, temporarily distracted from the trauma that would probably give her nightmares for years. Victoria Hale had built an empire by being ruthless, by never letting sentiment cloud her judgment, by always knowing exactly what she wanted and taking it without apology. For the first time in her life, she had no idea what she wanted. Or maybe that wasn't true. Maybe for the first time in her life, she wanted something that couldn't be bought or negotiated or acquired through sheer force of will. She wanted to be the kind of person who deserved the trust she'd seen in Emma's eyes when the child had finally smiled at her. And she had absolutely no idea how to become that person. Ryan arrived at the castle just after 9 in the evening, looking like a man who'd been wrung dry and left to hang in the wind. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. His shoulders carried the weight of 6 hours of intensive questioning, and when he walked into the suite and saw Emma curled up asleep on the sofa with a book still open in her lap, his entire body seemed to sag with relief. "She's been asleep for about an hour," Victoria said softly from her position by the fireplace. "We had dinner, read some stories, and she just sort of drifted off mid-sentence." Ryan crossed the room and knelt beside his daughter, pressing a kiss to her forehead with such gentle reverence that Victoria had to look away from the intimacy of it. "Thank you," he said without turning around, "for taking care of her. I know that's not exactly in your wheelhouse." "I managed." Victoria set down the tablet she'd been pretending to read for the last hour. "How did it go with the investigators?" "About as well as could be expected. They'll be filing their preliminary report within 48 hours. But the short version is that lightning hit the hydraulic reservoir at exactly the wrong angle, caused a cascade failure that shouldn't have been possible, and we're all extremely lucky to be alive." Ryan stood slowly, his knees cracking in a way that made him wince. "They want me back tomorrow for follow-up questions, but for now, I'm officially released to get some sleep." "There's a second bedroom through that door. It's yours for as long as you need it." Ryan finally looked at her directly, and Victoria saw surprise flicker across his exhausted features. "You're staying here too?" "I told you I was. Did you think I was lying?" "I thought you'd find somewhere more private. CEOs don't usually share accommodations with mechanics and their children." The casual classification stung, though Victoria supposed she'd earned it. "Well, this CEO does. At least for tonight. Emma was worried about you being alone after the debriefing, and I told her you'd both be right here where she could find you in the morning." Something in Ryan's expression softened. "You talked to her about me?" "She talked about you. I mostly just listened." Victoria paused, then added carefully, "She told me her mother died, and that she blames you." Ryan's face went carefully blank, the kind of emotional shutdown Victoria recognized from 1,000 corporate negotiations where someone was trying desperately not to show weakness. "Did she?" "Ryan, I'm not trying to pry. I just thought you should know what your daughter is carrying around." "I know what she's carrying around. I'm the one who put it there." Ryan moved to the window, his back to Victoria, and when he spoke again his voice was rough with barely contained emotion. "My wife Sarah died 3 years ago. Car accident on her way to pick Emma up from daycare because I was deployed overseas on a mission that ran 18 hours longer than planned. If I'd been home like I should have been, Sarah wouldn't have been driving. Emma wouldn't have spent 3 hours in an emergency waiting room being told her mother wasn't coming back. And I wouldn't have come home to find my daughter traumatized, and my mother-in-law convinced I'd murdered her child through neglect." The words fell into the quiet room like stones into deep water, creating ripples that spread out in all directions. Victoria sat very still, barely breathing, afraid that any sound would stop him from continuing. "The Air Force gave me compassionate leave," Ryan continued, his voice flat and distant. 30 days to bury my wife and figure out how to be a single father to a 4-year-old who barely remembered what I looked like because I'd been gone so much. Then they expected me back in the cockpit like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just lost everything that mattered. "But you went back." "I went back because flying was all I knew. It was all I'd ever been good at. And I told myself that Sarah would have wanted me to keep serving, keep doing the work that mattered." He laughed, a bitter sound devoid of humor. "God, I was so full of myself, so convinced that what I did was important enough to justify the cost." Victoria thought about her own justifications, the way she'd sacrificed relationships and friendships and anything resembling a personal life on the altar of Hale dynamics. The parallels were uncomfortable. "What changed?" she asked quietly. "There was a mission over hostile territory. Routine patrol that turned into a nightmare when we got intelligence about a refugee camp in the path of an airstrike. Command wanted us to stay on mission, maintain patrol pattern, let someone else handle the civilians. But I could see them on my instruments, hundreds of people, mostly women and children, right where a $50 million mistake was about to land." Ryan's hands gripped the window frame, knuckles white. "So I broke formation, disobeyed direct orders, flew my F-15 straight into a trajectory that forced the strike package to abort, saved probably 600 lives." He paused, "and crashed my aircraft into a mountainside in the process. Walked away without a scratch on me, but the plane was a total loss. $40 million turned into scrap metal because Captain Mercer decided he knew better than command." "But you saved 600 people." "I did. The Air Force court-martialed me anyway. Dishonorable discharge was on the table until someone high up decided that would look bad in the press. So they settled for forcing me to resign, stripping my flight status, and making it very clear that my career in aviation was over." Ryan finally turned from the window, and his face was raw with old grief. "I came home to Emma thinking I'd be there for her finally, that I'd be the father she deserved. But she took one look at me and screamed, because in her mind, I was the man who chose flying over her mother, who was never there when she needed me, who showed up for the funeral, but not for the 3 years before it." Victoria felt tears pricking at her eyes again. She was 4 years old and traumatized. Children that age don't understand. She understood enough. And she was right. Ryan's voice cracked slightly. "I had been choosing flying over my family. Every deployment I volunteered for, Every training exercise I stayed late for, every time I told Sarah I couldn't make it to Emma's school play or birthday party or bedtime because I had responsibilities. I was choosing. And Sarah paid the price for my choices. That's not fair to yourself. You were serving your country. I was serving my ego. The words came out harsh and absolute. I loved flying because it made me feel important, special, better than the ground-bound mortals who'd never know what it felt like to touch the sky. And I told myself that was noble service, but really it was just selfishness with a flag draped over it. The self-loathing in his voice was almost physical, and Victoria found herself standing without conscious decision, crossing the room to stand beside him at the window. You saved 600 people. That's not selfishness. It was the first unselfish thing I'd done in my entire military career, and it cost me everything. Funny how that works. Ryan shook his head slowly. After the court-martial, I couldn't fly commercial. Who's going to hire a pilot with a dishonorable conduct flag in their file? Couldn't go back to military flying. Couldn't do the only thing I'd ever been good at. So I learned to fix planes instead of fly them. Started from the bottom, working maintenance crews at regional airports, and worked my way up to where I could support Emma on my own. And your mother-in-law? She still blames you? She still blames me. Calls every few months to remind me that her daughter is dead because I couldn't be bothered to be a husband and father when it mattered. She's not wrong. Ryan met Victoria's eyes, and the pain in his gaze was almost too much to bear. That's what Emma is carrying around, the knowledge that her grandmother thinks I killed her mother, and some part of her probably agrees. Ryan, that's not... Emma loves you. Anyone can see that. She loves me because children love their parents even when those parents don't deserve it. It's not rational or earned. It just is. He turned away from the window, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. But love doesn't erase the damage. Every time I look at her, I see what my choices cost. Every nightmare she has about her mother. Every time she gets anxious about me leaving. Every therapy session we go to so she can learn to process her grief. That's all on me. Victoria wanted to argue, to tell him he was being too hard on himself, but she recognized the futility of it. She'd spent enough time drowning in her own guilt to know that logic rarely penetrated that kind of self-recrimination. Is that why you went into the cockpit today? She asked instead. To prove you could save people instead of hurting them? Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Then, I went into that cockpit because Emma was on that plane, and I'd rather die trying to save her than live knowing I could have done something and didn't. Everything else was just collateral benefit. You're still a hero to those 247 people who walked off that plane alive. I'm a mechanic who did what needed doing, nothing more. Ryan moved towards the bedroom where Emma slept, clearly ready to end this conversation. Thank you for taking care of her today. And for the rooms, we'll be out of your hair first thing in the morning. You don't have to leave. I meant what I said about the rooms being yours for as long as you need them. We can't afford this place, Ms. Hale, and I'm not accepting charity, no matter how nicely it's packaged. It's not charity. Consider it part of Atlas Air's compensation for your service today. They're covering all passenger accommodations, and you were more than a passenger. You were crew. Victoria was making this up as she went along, but it felt true enough. Besides, Emma deserves one night in a castle. Let her have that. Ryan studied her face, searching for the angle, the manipulation. Victoria kept her expression open and honest, and after a moment he nodded slowly. One night. Then we figure out our own arrangements. Fair enough. He started toward Emma, then paused and looked back. Why are you being kind now? What changed between the plane and here? Victoria considered the question, trying to find words for something she barely understood herself. I spent 3 hours sitting next to you thinking I was better than you because I have money and power and a corner office that overlooks Manhattan. Then I spent 45 minutes thinking I was going to die, and in those minutes, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that a man I dismissed as worthless was the only thing standing between me and the ocean. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. And then I spent an evening with your daughter, and I realized that you've built something I never could. Not with all my billions or all my business acumen. You've built a family, a real one, held together by love instead of obligation. And I'm trying to figure out if it's too late for me to learn how to build something that actually matters. Ryan's expression was unreadable. That's quite an epiphany for one day. Near-death experiences have a way of clarifying priorities. They do. Ryan lifted Emma gently from the sofa, and she stirred but didn't wake, automatically curling against her father's chest. For what it's worth, Ms. Hale, I don't think it's ever too late to change. If you actually want to. The question is whether you want to badly enough to do the hard work. What hard work? Figuring out who you are when you're not being a CEO. Most people spend their whole lives avoiding that question because the answer scares them. Ryan carried Emma toward the bedroom, then glanced back one more time. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be complicated. He disappeared into the bedroom, and Victoria was left alone in the sitting room with the dying fire and her thoughts. She pulled out her tablet and opened the file Marcus had sent an hour ago. Ryan Mercer's complete service record, every mission, every commendation, every black mark that had led to his resignation. She read it all, and with each page, the man she'd dismissed as a simple mechanic became more complex, more impressive, and more damaged than she'd imagined. There were citations for valor, recommendations from superior officers who called him one of the best pilots they'd ever seen, mission reports that read like action movies. And then there was the final mission, the one that had ended his career. The official report was dry and factual, but Victoria could read between the lines. Ryan had seen innocent people in danger and had made a split-second decision that cost him everything he'd worked for, just like he'd done today. The man didn't know how to be anything except a protector, even when protecting others destroyed him. Victoria set the tablet aside and stared into the fire. She'd built Hale Dynamics by being the opposite, by protecting herself first, always, and letting everyone else fend for themselves. It had made her rich and powerful and completely alone. She thought about Emma's question in the restaurant. Why were you so mean? Because being mean was easier than being vulnerable. Because cruelty was armor against a world that would hurt you if you let it. Because she'd learned young that kindness was weakness, and weakness got you crushed. But sitting here in a castle in Ireland, thinking about a 6-year-old who'd trusted her despite every reason not to, Victoria wondered if maybe she'd learned all the wrong lessons. Her phone buzzed with an incoming email. The subject line read, "Urgent. Information on Ryan Mercer you need to see." Victoria opened it and felt her stomach drop. Marcus had done more than just pull Ryan's service record. He'd dug deeper, found connections she'd never have made on her own. And what he'd found changed everything. The refugee camp Ryan had saved 3 years ago had been in a region Victoria knew well, because Hale Dynamics had contracted with the military for satellite surveillance in that exact area. And one of the refugees Ryan had saved was a man named David Hale, Victoria's father. Her hands started shaking. She read the report 3 times, then a 4th, but the words didn't change. Her father had been in that camp on a humanitarian mission, providing medical supplies to displaced families. The airstrike that Ryan had prevented would have killed him along with 600 others. Ryan Mercer had saved her father's life, and in doing so, he'd destroyed his own career. Victoria stood abruptly, pacing the room as her mind raced through implications. Her father had never mentioned being in danger, had never talked about a close call with an airstrike. But then again, David Hale had died 8 months later of a heart attack, and there were a lot of things they'd never gotten around to discussing, like the fact that Victoria had built her empire partly out of rage at him for dying and leaving her alone with a company she'd been too young to run. She'd been 24 when David Hale had collapsed in his office, and Victoria had stepped into his shoes with something to prove to everyone who doubted her. She'd spent 8 years turning Hale Dynamics from a successful company into a juggernaut, and she'd done it by being ruthless and uncompromising and everything her father had tried to teach her not to be. And the man who'd given her those extra 8 months with her father, who'd sacrificed his career so David Hale could come home and see his daughter one more time, was sleeping in the next room, broken by the choice he'd made. Victoria's vision blurred with tears. This was too much. Too many coincidences. Too much cosmic irony. She'd mocked the man who'd saved her father, belittled him, offered him money like he was a problem to be solved instead of a human being deserving of dignity. She thought about waking him, telling him what she'd learned. But what would she say? Thank you for saving my father so I could spend 8 more months resenting him for not being immortal? Thank you for destroying your life so mine could continue? There were no words adequate for this. The bedroom door opened and Ryan emerged, having changed into sweatpants and an old Air Force t-shirt. He stopped when he saw Victoria's face. "What happened?" he asked, instantly alert despite his exhaustion. "Nothing. I got some news. About work." The lie tasted like ash, but Victoria couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. Not yet. Not when she didn't know what it meant or how to process it. Ryan didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. "If you need to talk, I don't. But thank you." Victoria wiped at her eyes, angry at herself for the weakness. "You should sleep. You've earned it." "So should you. You look like you're about to collapse." "I'm fine." "Ms. Hale." Ryan's voice was gentle but firm. "I've seen enough trauma today to recognize it when it's staring me in the face. Whatever news you got, it's eating you alive. You don't have to tell me what it is, but at least acknowledge that you're human enough to be affected by it." The kindness in his voice after everything she'd done to him was almost more than Victoria could bear. "Why are you being nice to me? After how I treated you?" "Because holding grudges takes energy I don't have. And because Emma liked you enough to trust you with Mr. Hoppy for 2 hours. That bunny doesn't get loaned out lightly." Ryan moved toward his bedroom, then paused. "Also because I recognize someone drowning in guilt when I see one. Takes one to know one, I suppose." He disappeared into the bedroom before Victoria could respond, leaving her alone with the fire and the weight of knowledge she hadn't asked for and didn't know what to do with. She stayed up until the fire died completely, staring at the email on her tablet and trying to reconcile the man she'd judged with the man who'd unknowingly given her the greatest gift anyone could, time with her father before he was gone. Sometime around 3 in the morning, Victoria made a decision. She couldn't undo what she'd said on the plane, couldn't take back the cruelty or the judgment, but she could do something that actually mattered. She opened her laptop and began drafting emails, making calls that would wake up executives on 3 continents. By the time the Irish sun started climbing above the horizon, Victoria had set in motion a plan that would either be the best decision she'd ever made or the one that finally proved she'd lost her mind entirely. Either way, she was done measuring worth in dollars and market share. It was time to start measuring it in the things that couldn't be bought. Ryan emerged from his bedroom around 7, looking marginally more rested, to find Victoria still awake and working at the dining table with her laptop and 3 empty coffee cups scattered around her. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "Sleep is for people without empires to restructure," Victoria said, then realized how that sounded. "Sorry, old habits." Restructuring empires at 7 in the morning seems excessive, even for a CEO. Ryan moved to the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, then refilled Victoria's without asking. "What's going on?" Victoria saved her work and closed the laptop. "I'm making some changes to how Hale Dynamics operates, starting with our employment practices and moving through just about everything else." "Because of yesterday?" "Because of a lot of things. Yesterday just happened to be the catalyst." Victoria accepted the coffee gratefully. "I've spent 8 years building a company that values profit over people. Time to see if I can build something better." Ryan studied her over the rim of his cup. "That's admirable. Also, probably going to cost you a fortune and make a lot of powerful people angry." "I'm aware. I'm doing it anyway." "Why?" Victoria met his eyes steadily. "Because a very wise 6-year-old asked me why I was mean, and I didn't have a good answer. And because you were right yesterday. I can't throw money at this and make it go away. I have to actually change, starting with the company that's defined my entire adult life." Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup and said, "I need to tell you something. About Emma's mother." The abrupt shift in topic caught Victoria off guard. "You don't have to." "I need to, because you've been kind to Emma and she trusts you. And if you're going to be around her at all, you should know the whole truth." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Sarah didn't die instantly in the accident. She survived for 6 hours in the hospital before her injuries were too severe. And in those 6 hours, while I was flying home from halfway around the world, she wrote me a letter." He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his photos, and handed it to Victoria. The image showed a handwritten note on hospital stationery, the writing shaky but legible. Victoria read it and felt her heart break. The letter said that Sarah loved Ryan, that she'd never blamed him for following his calling, that Emma needed him to be strong and present and everything he'd been too busy to be before. It said that Ryan needed to forgive himself for the choices that had led them here, because holding on to guilt would poison him and hurt their daughter. It said to live fully and love deeply and not let her death be the thing that stopped him from being the man she'd fallen in love with. It ended with, "Fly when you need to fly. Emma will understand someday. I love you both. Don't let my mother convince you otherwise." Victoria handed the phone back with shaking hands. "Ryan, I'm so sorry." "I've read that letter every day for 3 years," Ryan said quietly. "And every day I still can't forgive myself for not being there, for her having to write it alone in a hospital room while I was 30,000 feet in the air over an ocean, racing home too late to say goodbye." "But she forgave you." "She did. Emma's grandmother never will, and some part of Emma probably won't either, and I've made my peace with that." Ryan pocketed his phone. "But I wanted you to know because you asked yesterday why I don't fly anymore. The truth is, I stopped flying because I thought that's what Sarah would have wanted. But that letter says otherwise. She wanted me to keep being who I was, just be better at balancing it with being a father." So why stay on the ground?" "Because for 3 years I've been too afraid to trust myself in the air. Too convinced that if I got back in a cockpit, I'd prove everyone right, that I was selfish and reckless and willing to sacrifice anything for the thrill of flight." Ryan's voice dropped. "But yesterday, when I walked into that cockpit and took those controls, something clicked. I wasn't flying for the thrill. I was flying because my daughter needed me to, because 247 people needed me to. And for the first time since Sarah died, I felt like maybe I could do this again, be a pilot again, without it destroying everything I love." Victoria thought about the corporate titan she'd been 48 hours ago, so certain of her worth and her choices. Then she thought about the woman she was becoming, sitting across from a man who'd learned that worth wasn't measured in altitude or achievements, but in the moments when you chose love over fear. "You should fly again," she said firmly. "Not because you have something to prove, but because you're brilliant at it, and the world needs brilliant pilots who understand that people matter more than protocols." Ryan smiled, small and genuine. "Is that your professional opinion as a CEO?" "It's my personal opinion as someone who's watched you save everyone on a plane while being terrified the entire time and still managing to comfort your daughter through her fear. That's not selfishness, Ryan. That's heroism." Before Ryan could respond, Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, Mr. Hoppy dragging from one hand. "Daddy? Are we really in a castle?" Ryan's entire face transformed, the grief and exhaustion falling away as he smiled at his daughter. "We really are, sweetheart. Come see." He scooped her up and carried her to the window, pointing out turrets and gardens, and a pond with swans gliding across its surface. Emma's delighted laughter filled the room, pure and uncomplicated, and Victoria felt something inside her chest that had been frozen for decades finally begin to thaw. This was what mattered, not quarterly earnings or market share or the size of your empire. This, right here, a father and daughter finding joy in swans and castles after surviving the kind of trauma that would haunt them both for years. And Victoria Hale, who'd spent 32 years convinced that sentiment was weakness, finally understood what strength actually looked like. 3 days later, Victoria stood in the boardroom of Hale Dynamics Manhattan headquarters and looked out at 12 faces that ranged from confused to openly hostile. Her executive team had flown in from around the world for this emergency meeting, and none of them looked happy about it. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," said Gerald Hutchins, her CFO, and the man who'd helped build the financial architecture that had made Hale Dynamics worth billions. "You want to restructure our entire employment framework to prioritize hiring veterans and overlooked professionals, create mentorship programs that will cost millions annually, and establish a charitable foundation that diverts 15% of our profits to organizations supporting military families and single parents." "That's correct," Victoria said calmly. "And you expect us to just accept this, without discussion or analysis or any consideration for shareholder value?" "I expect you to recognize that shareholder value isn't the only metric that matters. And yes, I expect you to accept it, because I still own controlling interest in this company, and this is the direction we're going." The room erupted. Voices overlapped, arguments cascaded into one another, and Victoria let it happen for exactly 30 seconds before she raised her hand for silence. Years of commanding boardrooms had taught her timing, and she used it now. I know this seems sudden. I know it contradicts everything we've built this company on. But I've had what you might call a clarifying experience, and I've realized that we've been measuring success all wrong. Victoria's voice was steady and absolute. We've built an empire, yes, but we've done it by grinding people down, by valuing credentials over competence, by promoting cutthroat competition over collaboration. And I'm done with that. You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment, said Patricia Zhao, head of operations and Victoria's closest thing to a friend in the corporate world. This isn't like you. You're right, it's not like the person I was a week ago, but that person was wrong about a lot of things, and I'm trying to fix that. By destroying everything we've built? Gerald's voice rose with frustration. Victoria, be reasonable. We have a responsibility to our shareholders, We have a responsibility to be better than we are, Victoria interrupted. And if that costs us some market share or makes our quarterly earnings look less impressive, I can live with that. Can you? The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Patricia was the first to break it. What happened to you in Ireland? She asked quietly. And don't tell me it was just the plane crash. I've known you for 8 years, and you've never let trauma affect your business decisions before. Victoria thought about lying, about keeping her private revelation private. But if she was going to ask her team to embrace radical honesty and vulnerability, she had to model it herself. I met someone who reminded me what actual worth looks like, she said simply. Someone I judged and dismissed based on superficial nonsense, who then saved my life and showed me that everything I thought mattered was just noise. And I realized that if I died tomorrow, my legacy would be a company that made rich people richer while grinding everyone else into dust. I want to leave something better than that. So this is about your ego, Gerald said, about feeling good about yourself. Maybe it is, but it's also about being able to look at myself in the mirror and not see someone who values quarterly earnings over human dignity. Victoria leaned forward, her hands flat on the polished conference table. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you what's happening. If you can't support it, I'll accept your resignation and replace you with someone who can. The threat hung in the air, and Victoria watched her executive team process it. Some looked angry, some looked thoughtful, and Patricia looked like she was reassessing everything she thought she knew about her boss. Finally, Patricia spoke. I'm in? Not because I think this is good business. Honestly, I think it's probably going to cost us, but because I've spent 8 years watching you turn into someone I barely recognize, and whoever you met in Ireland seems to have reminded you that you're actually human. I'd like to see where that goes. One by one, the others fell in line. Some enthusiastic, some reluctant, but all apparently unwilling to walk away from the empire they'd helped build just because the Empress had developed a conscience. The meeting lasted another 4 hours, hammering out details and timelines and implementation strategies. By the time Victoria finally returned to her office, it was well past midnight, and she was running on fumes and the kind of exhilarated exhaustion that came from burning your old life down and hoping something better would rise from the ashes. Her assistant had left a stack of messages on her desk, and Victoria flipped through them with half her attention until one caught her eye. A handwritten note on hotel stationery from Dromoland Castle. Ms. Hale, thank you for everything. Emma and I are heading back to the States tomorrow. I wanted to let you know that I've accepted a position with Atlas Air as a flight instructor and safety consultant. Turns out saving a plane full of people looks good on a resume. I don't know if our paths will cross again, but I hope your changes to Hale Dynamics work out the way you're hoping. You're braver than you think. Ryan. Victoria read the note 3 times, trying to parse the emotions it triggered. Relief that Ryan had found a path back to aviation. Regret that she'd never told him about her father. And something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like loss. She pulled out her phone and dialed before she could overthink it. Ryan answered on the 3rd ring, his voice rough with sleep. Hello? It's Victoria Hale. I'm sorry for calling so late. Ms. Hale. She heard rustling, the sound of Ryan sitting up. Is everything all right? I got your note about the job with Atlas Air. Congratulations. Thank you. It's not flying the line yet, but it's a start. And it means I can work mostly from home, be there for Emma. A pause. Was that all you wanted to say? At 1 in the morning, New York time? Victoria took a breath. I need to tell you something. About why I was on that flight to Zurich, and about my father. She told him everything then, about David Hale's humanitarian work, about the refugee camp, about Marcus's research that had connected the dots she'd never have found on her own. She told him about the 8 months between the mission Ryan had aborted and her father's death, about the conversations they'd had and the things left unsaid, about the company she'd built partly to honor him and partly to prove she didn't need anyone. When she finished, Ryan was quiet for a long time. "You're telling me I saved your father's life," he finally said, his voice strange and tight. "You saved his life, and he never knew it. He came home from that mission and never mentioned the airstrike. I think he didn't want to worry me. And then he died, and I never got to tell him." Victoria's voice cracked. "I never got to tell him a lot of things. But because of you, I got 8 more months. 8 months I wouldn't have had if you'd followed orders and stayed in formation." Victoria. Ryan rarely used her first name, and hearing it now made her chest ache. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. Needed you to understand that when I offered you money on that plane, it wasn't charity or guilt. It was me trying to repay a debt I didn't even know I owed, a debt I can never actually repay. You don't owe me anything. I made that choice for 600 strangers, not for your father specifically. I know. But it still matters. It still means that the man I mocked and dismissed gave me something precious without knowing it, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift." Ryan was quiet again, and Victoria could hear Emma's voice in the background, asking something Victoria couldn't make out. Ryan's muffled response, gentle and patient, then he was back. "Emma wants to know if you're okay. She says you sound sad." Victoria laughed, a watery sound. "Tell her I'm fine, just tired. She also wants to know if you'll come visit us sometime. Apparently she's decided you're her friend now, and friends visit each other." The casual invitation hit Victoria harder than any business deal ever had. "I'd like that, very much." "Then we'll make it happen. Maybe when things settle down with your company restructuring." Ryan paused. "That's really happening? The changes you mentioned at the castle?" "It's really happening. I burned a lot of bridges in a boardroom today, and I'm probably going to burn more before this is over. But yes, it's happening." "Good. The world needs more people willing to burn bridges when the bridges are leading to the wrong place." They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing particularly important. Emma's adjustment to being back home, Ryan's training schedule with Atlas Air, the weather in New York versus Dublin. It was comfortable and easy in a way Victoria's conversations rarely were. And when they finally said goodbye, she felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for days. The next 6 months were a controlled demolition of everything Victoria had built. She fired executives who couldn't adapt to the new culture, promoted people from within based on competence rather than credentials, and personally reviewed every veteran application that came through their new hiring initiative. The financial press called her everything from visionary to insane, and her stock price fluctuated wildly as investors tried to figure out if this was brilliant strategy or corporate suicide. Victoria didn't care. She was too busy building something that actually mattered. She also made time, for the first time in her adult life, for things that weren't work. She visited Ryan and Emma twice, short trips to their small apartment in Queens that felt more like home than her penthouse ever had. She read to Emma, helped with homework, listened to Ryan talk about his students at Atlas Air with the kind of passion she'd once reserved for quarterly earnings reports. And slowly, carefully, she and Ryan built something that looked like friendship, but felt like it might be capable of becoming more if they were both brave enough to let it. It was during her third visit on a crisp October evening while Emma was at a sleepover with her friend Mia that Ryan finally asked the question Victoria had been waiting for. "Why are you here?" He handed her a beer, cheap domestic, nothing like the wine she usually drank, and settled beside her on his threadbare couch. "Really here, I mean. Not the surface reason about checking on Emma or whatever you tell yourself. Why are you actually spending your limited free time in Queens with a flight instructor and his kid?" Victoria took a sip of beer, buying time. "Do you want the honest answer, or the one that protects my pride?" "Honest. Always honest. Because you and Emma are the first people in my life who like me for reasons that have nothing to do with my money or my power or what I can do for them. You like me because I read to Emma with funny voices, and because I ask about your day and actually listen to the answer, and that's..." She paused, searching for words. That's so rare I don't even know what to do with it. Ryan set down his beer and turned to face her fully. That's not the only reason I like you. No? No. I like you because you're brave enough to completely reinvent yourself when you realize you've been wrong. I like you because you hold yourself to impossible standards and somehow still manage to meet most of them. I like you because you spent 6 months learning about aircraft maintenance just so you could have intelligent conversations with me about my work. He reached out and took her hand, and the gesture was so natural Victoria almost didn't notice. And I like you because when Emma has nightmares about her mother, you don't try to fix it with money or logic. You just hold her and let her be sad, which is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. Victoria felt tears pricking at her eyes for what felt like the 1,000th time since that flight. I'm not brave. I'm terrified constantly that I'm going to mess this up, that I'll revert to being the person I was and destroy everything good I've managed to build. That's what makes it brave, being terrified and doing it anyway. Ryan's thumb traced patterns on her palm, and Victoria's breath caught. Can I tell you something I've been thinking about for months now? Please. That night on the plane, when I walked into the cockpit, I was convinced I was going to die. I'd made my peace with it, actually, told myself that if saving Emma and 200 other people was my last act, that was a pretty good way to go. He met her eyes, and Victoria saw vulnerability there that made her chest ache. But when I landed that plane and walked out of the cockpit, the first person I saw was you, holding my daughter, crying. And I thought, if I'd died up there, I'd never have gotten to see that, never have gotten to know the woman underneath all that armor. Ryan, let me finish. I've spent 3 years convinced I didn't deserve happiness, that loving someone again would be a betrayal of Sarah's memory. But I read her letter every day, and every day it tells me the same thing, that she wanted me to live fully and love deeply and not let grief turn me into a ghost. Ryan's hand tightened on hers. I'm not saying I'm ready for anything serious right now. Emma has to come first, and she's still processing so much. But I am saying that when I think about the future, you're in it, and I wanted you to know that. Victoria couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, could only sit there with her hand in his and feel the weight of everything they'd both survived pressing down on them like gravity. I'm broken, she finally managed. I'm rebuilding, but I'm still broken. I don't know how to be in a relationship. Don't know how to put someone else first. Don't know how to be a mother figure to Emma when I barely know how to be human. Good thing I'm broken too, then. We can figure it out together. Ryan smiled, small and genuine. And for the record, Emma already loves you. Has for months. She drew a picture of the 3 of us at her school, and her teacher asked if you were her mom. Emma said no, but maybe someday if you wanted to be. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable, and Ryan pulled her against his chest and let her cry the way she'd let Emma cry months ago in an airport restaurant. He didn't try to fix it or minimize it or make it about anything other than what it was. Grief and hope and terror, all tangled together into something that felt uncomfortably like the beginning of healing. When Victoria finally pulled back, Ryan kissed her forehead with a tenderness that made her believe for the first time in her life that maybe she was worth loving after all. The restructuring of Hale Dynamics took 18 months total. By the time Victoria stood in front of her shareholders for the annual meeting, the company looked nothing like it had before the flight. Profits were down 12%, but employee satisfaction was up 47%. Turnover had dropped to almost nothing, and the Veterans Hiring Initiative had brought in some of the most talented people Victoria had ever worked with, including a former Air Force logistics officer who'd revolutionized their supply chain and a Navy engineer who'd designed a new manufacturing process that would save them millions annually. The financial press was calling it the Hale Transformation, and business schools were already writing case studies about it. Victoria called it making amends. She and Ryan took things slowly, dating like normal people despite the fact that nothing about their situation was normal. Emma was the priority always, and Victoria learned to measure her life in school plays and bedtime stories and the particular magic of a 6-year-old's laughter instead of quarterly reports and board meetings. It was terrifying and wonderful, and nothing like the life she'd planned. It was also, she discovered, exactly what she'd been missing all along. On the 1-year anniversary of the flight, Atlas Air held a ceremony honoring Ryan and Captain Mitchell for their actions that night. Victoria attended with Emma, watching from the audience as the two men accepted their awards with the kind of humble grace that made Victoria's chest ache with pride. When it was Ryan's turn to speak, he kept it brief. A year ago, I walked into a cockpit convinced my flying days were behind me. I thought I'd given up everything that mattered to keep my daughter safe, and I'd made peace with that sacrifice. But that night taught me that sometimes the things we think we've lost forever are just waiting for the right moment to come back to us. His eyes found Victoria in the crowd, then Emma, beside her. And sometimes the people we think we're saving end up saving us instead. Thank you to Atlas Air for giving me a second chance. And thank you to Captain Mitchell for trusting a washed-up fighter pilot with $40 million worth of aircraft and 247 lives. The audience laughed, and Mitchell clasped Ryan's shoulder with obvious affection. After the ceremony, Emma ran to her father and launched herself into his arms with the kind of enthusiasm only children could muster. "Daddy, you were so brave up there. Everyone was clapping for you." "I was just doing my job, sweetheart." Ryan caught Victoria's eye over Emma's head and smiled. "Though I had some pretty good motivation to get everyone down safely." Victoria crossed to them, and Emma immediately reached out to pull her into the hug, creating a tangle of arms and laughter that felt more like family than anything Victoria had ever known. "I'm proud of you," Victoria said quietly, meant just for Ryan. "For getting back in the air. For letting yourself be happy again." "I had a good teacher," Ryan said, and kissed her in front of everyone, colleagues and reporters, and Emma, who giggled and announced that kissing was gross, but she'd make an exception this one time. 6 months later, Victoria sold her penthouse and moved into a larger apartment 3 floors above Ryan's. Emma had her own room decorated exactly how she wanted it, with stars painted on the ceiling and shelves full of books and a window seat where she could watch planes taking off from LaGuardia. 9 months after that, Ryan proposed on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening while they were doing dishes together after dinner. No grand gesture, no expensive ring, just a simple question asked with the kind of quiet certainty that came from knowing exactly what you wanted and finally being brave enough to ask for it. Victoria said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. They got married in a small ceremony at the same castle in Ireland where they'd first started to understand each other. Emma was the flower girl, wearing a dress she'd picked out herself and carrying Mr. Hoppy in a small basket because he was family and family didn't get left behind. Patricia flew in from New York, along with half of Hale Dynamics' executive team. Captain Mitchell attended with his wife, and several of Ryan's former students from Atlas Air came to celebrate the man who'd taught them that heroism wasn't about following rules. It was about knowing when breaking them was the only moral choice. During the reception, Emma tugged on Victoria's dress. "Can I call you Mom now? Or is that weird?" Victoria knelt down so they were eye to eye. "It's not weird at all, sweetheart. I'd be honored if you called me Mom." "Even though I already had a mom who died?" "Your first mom will always be your first mom, and nobody can take that away from you. But I think maybe hearts are big enough to hold more than one person, don't you? Your dad loves me, and he still loves your first mom. That doesn't make either love less real." Emma considered this with her usual seriousness. Then she nodded. "Okay. Mom it is." She paused. "Does this mean you'll read me stories every night? Because Daddy does funny voices, but you do better sound effects." Victoria laughed and pulled Emma into a hug. "Deal. I'll do sound effects if you promise to be patient with me when I mess up, because I'm still learning how to be a mom." "That's okay. I'm still learning how to be a daughter to 2 moms. We can learn together." The simple wisdom of it took Victoria's breath away. She'd spent 32 years thinking strength meant never needing anyone, never showing weakness, never admitting that you didn't have all the answers. But sitting here in an Irish castle with her new daughter in her arms, and her husband dancing with elderly relatives across the room, Victoria finally understood that real strength was knowing you were broken and choosing to heal anyway. It was knowing you'd been cruel and choosing kindness. It was knowing you'd measured all the wrong things and choosing to start over. It was knowing you'd been given an impossible gift by a man you'd dismissed and spending the rest of your life trying to be worthy of that second chance. 2 years after the wedding, Victoria stood in the Atlas Air Training Facility and watched Ryan teach a class of new pilots about emergency procedures and split-second decision-making. Emma sat beside her, 9 years old now, and already talking about becoming a pilot herself someday. "Your dad is really good at this," Victoria murmured. He's the best, Emma said with absolute certainty. Everyone says so. He teaches them about flying, but he also teaches them about being brave when you're scared, and about saving people even when it costs you everything. Victoria watched Ryan demonstrate something on the simulator, his hands moving with the practiced grace of someone who'd been born to fly, and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. That night on the plane had taken a woman who'd thought she had everything and shown her she had nothing that mattered. It had taken a man who'd thought he'd lost everything and given him a path back to the sky. And it had given them both something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. A family built not on obligation or tradition, but on the radical choice to love despite fear, to heal despite damage, to believe that broken things could become beautiful if you were willing to do the work. As Ryan's class ended and he caught sight of Victoria and Emma in the observation room, his face lit up with the kind of uncomplicated joy that still made Victoria's breath catch. He waved, and Emma waved back with enthusiastic abandon. Victoria thought about the woman she'd been on that flight, brittle and cruel and so certain of her own superiority. That woman wouldn't recognize the life Victoria had now. Would probably despise it, actually. Would see the smaller apartment and the family dinners and the hours spent at school events as weakness, as settling, as giving up everything she'd worked for. But that woman had been wrong about everything that mattered. This, Ryan and Emma, and the messy, imperfect, absolutely terrifying work of building a life with other people, this was what strength actually looked like. This was what victory felt like when you finally learned to measure it in love instead of market share. This was what happened when arrogance fell silent and courage finally answered the call. And as Victoria stood there watching her husband teach young pilots how to save lives, and her daughter dream about touching the sky, she understood something she'd never quite grasped before. Sometimes the people we mock become our salvation. Sometimes the things we lose are less important than the things we find. And sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the beginning of something better than we ever imagined possible, if we're brave enough to let them be.